When Russia invaded Ukraine, Vladimir Putin held on to the arrogant belief that his special military operation would be over in a matter of days. It wasn't. After that, Putin thought the sheer size of Russia's military would be enough to do the job. It wasn't. And now Putin relies heavily on foreign partners to provide manpower, investment, and so much more. Russia has a big debt to pay these partners, and it's paying it in a way that Putin never expected. Russia's Far East is falling into Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un's hands, and there's nothing that Putin can do to stop it. At least that's according to Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service, which published an interesting article on October 16th, detailing the several ways that China and North Korea are slowly turning Russia's Far East into areas of foreign economic control. That article says that Putin has become so desperate to keep his war in Ukraine going that he's having to stretch too far to pay back the few allies that have continued to support Russia directly. Putin isn't just using money. Russia can't afford anymore to pay for all that China and North Korea are doing for it. No, Putin is instead allegedly repaying these wartime allies with Russia's territory. Or as the Foreign Intelligence Service puts it, lacking the resources to develop the country's largest region, the Far Eastern Federal District, Moscow is opening the way for external expansion. This is essentially Putin saying to his allies that Russia can't develop these regions alone, so he wants their help to do it. The problem, which Putin doesn't appear to be able to see, is that encouraging this help only means that Russia is losing control of vast swathes of its territory. We'll start with China. A quick look at the Chinese investment into Russia's Far East is enough to see how China is digging its tendrils into this vast Russian region. Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service says that Chinese investments into Russia's Far East are likely to reach 1 trillion rubles by the end of 2025. That amounts to $12.6 billion, which is all money that China is using to gain influence. Russia thinks that it's getting a good deal here, but China doesn't invest like this out of the goodness of its collective heart. Using its financial muscle to gain influence is a huge part of China's global geopolitical strategy. The Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, is a perfect example, and it also showcases how nefarious China can be with these seemingly benevolent investments. As The Guardian highlighted in May, China looks set to receive a windfall of $22 billion in loan repayments from the world's poorest 75 nations as part of its BRI scheme. China offers investments to these nations, allowing them to build infrastructure they otherwise wouldn't be able to afford. That investment has to be repaid, and that's all it takes. China has these typically poor nations on the hook for as long as it wants afterward. Either they repay or China exercises a greater level of control over those nations. It's a mobster-esque loan shark strategy. But it works, and China seems to be planting the seeds of that strategy in Russia's Far East. However, there's a catch. What China is doing in Russia's Far East doesn't seem to follow the typical BRI pattern. The investment is there, but the infrastructure projects that usually follow are nowhere to be seen. Instead, as Senator Viktor Kalashnikov from Russia's Khabarovsk region suggests, China is building its influence via trade. In Khabarovsk alone, Kalashnikov says the volume of trade between Russia and China increased by 5.5 million tons in 2024 alone. The first half of 2025 saw another substantial increase, as trade ballooned by another 36%. China is being clever here, knowing that Russia is unlikely to accept the sorts of unfair loans it typically offers via the BRI. China is instead making the Russian regions it wants to control dependent on China for trade. These upward trends aren't happening by accident. China is putting itself into a position where it has massive amounts of leverage in Khabarovsk. All it will have to do is threaten to pull the plug once that region is almost wholly dependent on China for trade, and Beijing will have the control that it seeks. Dagen adds that much of China's investment is also focused on resource extraction, which is a whole other problem for Russia. If China is taking Russian resources in the Far East, Putin is losing out on the money that those resources could generate. Russia's president has to repay his war debt somehow. This is how he's doing it, Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service claims. However, the expansion of economic influence isn't all that China is doing to subtly shift control of Russia's Far East out of Putin's hands. In a country that has a population of over 1.4 billion, people are a commodity. And China is using this commodity to great effect against Russia, as it's slowly been implementing what Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service calls a creeping demographic change in Russia's Far East. According to the report, China has managed to send up to 2 million of its citizens to live and work in the region between the Ural Mountains and Vladivostok. This is all by design, with Putin approving everything. Most of the Chinese nationals arriving in these regions work under visa-free agreements and are operating inside Special Economic Zones, or SEZs, in Russia's Far East. SEZs are interesting for a simple reason. They are areas within a country that operate under different business and trade regulations from the rest of the country. In Russia's case, this appears to mean that China is setting up SEZs where trade and business rules are Chinese rather than Russian in Russia's Far East. Again, it's all about control, and these SEZs see that control slipping out of Putin's hands. The fact that China's immigrant workers are also being allowed to operate without visas lends more support to the argument that the SEZs China now occupies essentially no longer belong to Russia. Presumably, Russia has some sort of agreement in place where it can strip the regions China is populating of their SEZ status if it needs to do so. However, Putin would be loath to exercise that sort of power. If he's paying for Chinese support using land in Russia's Far East, that support disappears as soon as he tries to take that land back. Russia may never be able to reclaim these SEZs. And if it tries, it faces the tricky task of expelling around 2 million Chinese nationals from its territory without angering President Xi. Earning the ire of China is the last thing that Putin wants to do right now. After all, as Reuters reported on September 25th, Chinese engineers are working alongside sanctioned Russian drone manufacturers to help them tweak and perfect their products. Putin needs these drones. In 2025, Russia's aerial strategy has evolved a massive escalation in drone attacks on Ukrainian cities, with reportedly every month since May witnessing the launch of at least 4,000 and up to 6,297 drones targeting Ukraine. That's according to the Institute for Science and International Security, which also notes that there hasn't been a month in 2025 since Russia has launched fewer than 2,000 drones at Ukraine. It seems that Russia is building those drones with China's help. That's yet another piece of leverage Xi holds over Putin. Try to stop China's creeping demographic and economic expansion into the Far East now, and those drone engineers aren't likely to stay. So it's clear how China is slowly grabbing territory in China's Far East. But what about North Korea? According to Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service, Russia's big mistake here is welcoming scores of workers from North Korea into its Far East. Officially, the service says around 15,000 North Koreans have arrived in that region over the past year alone. Unofficially, the number may be as high as 50,000. The BBC also shares the 50,000 number in an August article in which it reports that the North Korean laborers being sent to work in Russia are operating in what it calls slave-like conditions. The outlet interviewed 6 workers who had managed to escape these conditions, with one worker, named Chan, detailing some truly horrifying conditions. Some people would leave their post to sleep in the day or fall asleep standing up, but the supervisors would find them and beat them. It was truly like we were dying, Chan told the BBC. The workers often worked late into the night with no lights or safety equipment, and another escapee says that he worked on a high-rise apartment block for 18 hours per day while in Russia. To Putin, this is all near-slave labor that is cheap, effective, and comes from an ally. To North Korea, it's a chance to build influence and develop a presence in Russia's Far East. Of course, North Korea isn't as capable as China when it comes to exerting economic holds over Russian territory. But with Russia clearly needing manpower to develop its Far East region, North Korea seems to be following China's blueprint when it comes to using its own people to gain leverage over Putin. North Korea is already getting plenty out of this arrangement. Note that we said North Korea and not North Korean workers. Those workers are receiving the bare minimum wages possible, while Kim Jong-un pockets $500 million per year from Russia, Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service claims. Plus, Russian companies have already ordered another 153,000 contracts for North Korean laborers, the service reports. Even if we assume that $500 million per year is for the unofficial 50,000 workers in Russia's Far East, that still amounts to $1.5 billion annually. But if the $500 million figure refers to the official count of 10,000 workers, then around 150,000 more means another $7.5 billion Russia has to find. Does Putin have that sort of money to spend on labor, given how much the Ukraine war is costing Russia? Perhaps not. And if he doesn't, North Korea may be in a position to use these worker contracts to conduct its own territory grabs in Russia's Far East. Russia seems to be oblivious to what's happening here, at least officially. In July, Korea Jungang Daily carried a story in which it said that Russia's lawmakers are endorsing their new North Korea workers as being more reliable than Russia's existing migrant workforce. They would be, given that they work under constant supervision and face the threat of punishment if they can't handle grueling 18-hour days. If these workers are more reliable, then Russia will rely on them even more. 153,000 new contracts makes a lot more sense in that context. And Putin either doesn't see or doesn't care about the impact this will have on Russia's Far East in the future. Russia's playing a very dangerous game here. The risks involved are massive. As Dargan points out, China and North Korea are each building leverage in different ways. Combining monetary muscle and sheer manpower, China is building influence in Russia's Far East, by creating economic dependency. North Korea is creating a separate dependency, this time on cheap labor. It's possible the two countries could end up colliding as their attempts to grab territory overlap, Dagan says. But even in that situation, Russia will be an ineffective mediator in conflicts over territory that Russia is supposed to control. It all adds up to a major problem for Russia, as Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service notes. The Kremlin risks losing control over 40% of its own territory, almost 7 million square kilometers with a population of 7.9 million, turning the Far East into an area of foreign strategies, the service says in conclusion to its report. That's a huge chunk of territory to risk to ensure continued Ukraine war support, and it could lead to Putin facing the ultimate irony. Expanding Russia to the west might lead to Russia losing far more in the east. Far from an age of expansion, Russia may be entering an age of contraction. At least that's according to author and investing expert Daniel Peris. Writing for Engelberg Ideas, Peris notes that Russia's demographic crisis is playing a part in what's happening in the country's Far East. The normal population replacement rate is 2.1 births per female for Russia. The total fertility rate is currently just 1.4, Peris says. That means that the population, currently around 145 million, is on its way to a forecast 136 million by mid-century. Perhaps it's this declining population, which is only being accelerated by the many casualties Russia has experienced in the war, that is making Putin so desperate for investment and labor. And at the very least, it's a contributing factor, as it adds a second shade to the unpretty painting Putin is creating. He's already allowed China and North Korea to place themselves in positions to grab Russian territory based on his single-minded focus on Ukraine. But even after the war ends, Putin will still need these two nations to offer as much as they are willing to solve the Russian demographic crisis. The influence runs deeper. Russia loses ground as a result. What we see here are the results of a series of mistakes Putin has made, starting with the annexation of Crimea in 2014. The New Eurasian Strategy Center says that Putin declared what Russia called its pivot to the east, a national priority for the 21st century in 2013, though it was forced to accelerate this pivot following its actions in Crimea. With the collective West coming down on Russia with sanctions and similar punishments, which have only gotten worse since Putin launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia's strategy was to reduce exposure to Western pressure by turning east as a counterbalance. At the time, this great pivot was all about securing access to new markets and developing a geopolitical foothold for Russia in the Asia-Pacific, the center says. But in reality, the pivot simply saw Russia switch its economic dependence on the West into an economic dependence on the likes of China and India. Those countries, which saw Russia as partners that were on its level, have instead been taking advantage of Russia's growing weakness since it invaded Ukraine. We see that in Russia's oil sales. Hit by price caps and sanctions, Russia turned to China and India to sell its oil. Both have enjoyed heavy discounts, with China alone having saved $10 billion in 2022 and 2023 by buying Russian oil. Putin sees this as a necessary monetary sacrifice to make to keep some cash flowing into Russia as the war rages on. China, India, and other buyers all see it as a way to both gain leverage and enrich themselves at Russia's expense. The point we're making here is that Putin understands how important the East is, both in terms of Russia's Far East and Asia as a whole. But what he's failed to do, time and time again, is establish Russia as a dominant geopolitical force in eastern regions. Now, Russia is dealing with the reverse of what it intended to happen with its pivot to the East. Russia was supposed to be the country gaining influence inside other nations. Instead, it's the likes of China and North Korea that are doing that to Russia. And again, this is all by Putin's mistaken design. In September, the Carnegie Endowment published an article in which it pointed out that Russia has placed almost all of its eggs in the Chinese basket. In doing so, the organization claims, Putin has only deepened what it calls Russia's vassalage to China. In other words, Putin is willingly making his country at least somewhat subservient to China, also that he can get what he wants in Ukraine. Russia's isolation from the West was entirely Putin's decision, and it's now coming back to hurt Russia. As Russia's estrangement from the West deepens, China's role as a lifeline to Putin's system is only set to grow, and there is no escape now, the Carnegie Endowment claims. When Putin turned his back on the West a decade ago, he had China to fill the void. But now, even if for some reason he chose to pivot away from Beijing, there is no credible alternative. That, in a nutshell, is where Putin's Far East problem lies. Russia could still hold some sway over North Korea, at least until it becomes totally dependent on the country for cheap labor that fills the void left by Russia's demographic issues and the loss of so many of the country's young men in Ukraine. But China is in a far greater position of power. Let's say Putin decides to reject all of China's investment, its 2 million people, and the SEZs being created in Russia's Far East. Where does he go next? The West isn't going to offer Russia a lifeline, at least not without Putin making major concessions in Ukraine. The refusal to make those concessions is what got Russia into this position to begin with, so that's not going to happen. There simply aren't any other nations with the sheer economic might of China that could keep Russia going. At least no other nations with which Putin hasn't thoroughly burned Russia's bridges. Xi has played Putin so well here that Russia is left with no other recourse. North Korea, almost like a vulture, is now taking advantage of Putin's weakness in Russia's Far East too. Does this mean that Russia will lose up to 40% of its Far East territory that Ukraine's foreign intelligence service claims to be at risk? It looks increasingly likely. As we speak, China is supposedly providing 80% of the critical parts Putin needs for his drone war, United 24 Media reported on October 15th. Russia is going to need those parts, along with the engineers, the investment, and the labor, for a long time to come, given that Russia's 2025 gains in Ukraine amount to 1% of the country's territory. Now, Russia occupies around 20% of Ukraine. It's taken over 3.5 years for Russia to get that far. With another 80% of Ukraine to go before Putin can declare victory, Russia would require decades' worth of help from its foreign allies that are even now using Russia's position to gain influence in the Russian Far East. It's just as the Carnegie Endowment says, there's no escape for Russia. Putin is reaping what he has sown, though he may be long gone by the time the full impact of the sacrifices he's made to support his Ukraine invasion is known. But if it's not China and North Korea taking Russian territory that eventually topples Putin, it could be a groundswell of anti-war sentiment inside his own country that does the job. Putin is growing ever more paranoid, and he has good reason to do so. As St. Petersburg erupts into protest, Putin fears that a coup may be imminent. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering the many mistakes Putin has made that all link to the Ukraine war. And as always, thank you for watching.